So let's talk about graphing a secant graph. So the key for this is secant is, remember the secant is the reciprocal of the cosine. So really what you have to do is graph the cosine graph with all of these things in it, and then I'll show you what you have to do. So I'm going to first graph the cosine one in black, but remember you're going to have to erase this when you're done. So what would the cosine, what would 3 plus 2 cosine x plus 3 pi over 2, how would that graph look? Well, remember this is your shift, this is your vertical shift, right? So it shifts up 3. So here's your midline. The 2 is your amplitude, right? So it's going to go all the way up to this line, and it's going to go all the way down to this line.
Yes.
You following? And then this is this plus 3 pi over 2 means it shifts left 3 pi over 2. So let's see. This is a little bit of the trickier one. So 3 pi over 2 to the left. Let's go like this. Let's call that pi. Let me see. Let's call this 2 pi. So this is negative 2 pi right here. I actually should write it down on the x-axis. So this is negative 2 pi. This is negative pi. No, that's not good. Let's try something else. This is the hardest part to these problems, is to figure out what you want your interval lengths to be. So since this is in pi over 2s, let's call this pi over 4, negative pi over 4. So this is negative pi over 2. So this is negative pi. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is negative 2 pi. Got it? Mm-hmm. So that means this is positive pi over 2, and this is positive pi. So what am I doing? I'm trying to figure out what this shift is going to look like. So normally your graph would have started, remember a cosine graph, in this case since it's a positive 2, it would start up here and it would go down and then end back up, right? The cosine graph. But it's going to shift over 3 pi over 2. So it's going to start at negative 3 pi over 2, which is negative 3.5 pi. So there's negative 3 pi over 2. It's going to start there on the top, and it's going to end. What's the period for this graph?
2 pi.
Yep, the period isn't any different than normal, so it's 2 pi. So it's going to go all the way to positive pi over 2. So it's going to end here, and it's going to go through the center. So your graph shifts over to the left that much. So think about what your middle point would be right here. So it would be at the bottom, and these 2 points, as I call them, points 2 and 4, would be here and here. So your graph, your cosine graph, would look like this. If this was a cosine graph, which it's not, but again, you're going to see why you have to do that. So that would be your cosine graph, your one period of your cosine graph. But it's not a cosine graph, it's a secant graph. So what do? Well, you take each one of these points and you take the reciprocals of them. What that amounts to is this. You're going to have a horizontal asymptote wherever your point is on, for any of the points that are on the midline, because you can't think of those as 0, and you can't divide by 0. Mm-hmm. So there's my vertical. I said horizontal asymptote, I meant vertical. There's my vertical asymptote, and there's my other vertical asymptote. Okay, and your graph, your secant graph, is going to be, now take this point. That point's still going to be on the graph, but it's going to flip. Everything's going to flip over like this. This point is still going to be on the red graph, and it's going to flip over like this. And it would keep going here.
Okay.
And this point's going to be here, and it's going to flip over like that. It's going to still be there. So then you take your eraser and you erase all the other stuff, because remember, that's not really part of the graph. That just helped you graph your secant graph. So this is your secant graph. And that's how you do that problem. Same with the cosecant graph, you do that with the sine graph. So again, what's the pattern? Graph the cosine or the secant, the reciprocal one, and then draw your asymptotes in wherever it goes through the midline for any of the points on the midline, and then use those to graph your reciprocal of that cosine or sine graph.